All right, we're back with these two Dr. Z Route 66s. And see the first video for how they came in. The owner wanted them to be made exactly the same, and I've tried to do that. We'll talk about a couple of little things left. Overall, this was not a difficult thing to do, just a lot of little details a lot of people would not be aware of. And that's not to say, oh, I'm the greatest, only listen to me. Other good techs do know this kind of stuff, but it's not common knowledge. Not every tech does, and most owners don't realize the little things that we have to deal with. Before we get into that, I want to talk about a few things. You may notice this added master volume with the twisted wires. Because the grids here are out of phase with each other, 180 degrees, twisting them like this, they cancel out any noise surrounding them. This is a really quiet way to do it. In fact, it's a little bit better than traditional shielded wire. And with the color scheme and the wires I used, it complements and matches the stock wiring. You can see the added master volume. It's a post-phase inverter. When it's on 10, it is out of the circuit. The standby switch issue, which I pointed out in the first video, how the implementation of standby in these amps is done, is really hard on rectifier tubes. It's really hard on the switches. It's not optimal. I spoke to the owner, and given the way these things were constructed with, output transformer center taps connected to the first filter cap stage and all that stuff, I said I can make it correct, but honestly, just don't use it. Doc, it hurts when I do this. Don't do that. So we're just going to leave the standby switch in play at all times. It's just a glorified mute in the circuit. The caps don't need it. The tubes don't need it. It serves no real role. Getting these amps to be as close to identical as possible had some tricky things, though. And that's what I alluded to earlier. Number one, this amp came in with 6L6s. This other amp came in with KT66s. The KT66 amp had spring tube retainers, the wrong kind, which would have stressed out and possibly broken the new KT66s. And this amp with the 6L6s had bear traps, and you can't use a bear trap on a KT66 tube, not well, because the base has got a slope to it. What I did was I removed the bear traps from this amp, including the one on the rectifier tube, because the bear trap on the rectifier tube in this amp was a real cheap one, that flimsy metal that gets fatigued and breaks. Put in a good quality Belton. And then let's take a look at the KT66s in the first amp with its spring retainers, which can damage the glass. You can see here that the springs are in contact with the glass, and the flanges up top are in contact with the glass, and the metal ring up top is in contact with the glass, and just a lot of stress points, and the metal and the glass heat up and cool off at different rates. All that can lead to a damaged tube, and KT66s are quite expensive. The problem with the stock spring retainers is that they were designed for 6L6s and EL34s, which have very different dimensions than a KT66. So all those problems go away when I put in the proper KT66 style tube retainer, which is also used for 6550s and KT88s. You can see here, there's a gap between the springs and the sides of the glass. The flanges up top, the metal flanges, are not contacting the tube. And even the metal ring on top is not contacting the glass because I put in these little silicone pads, these little disc pads. So there's not going to be that heat discrepancy between the glass and the metal. There's not going to be pressure points from glass contacting and rubbing up on metal, especially as the metal can move. Dr. Z makes a pretty good amp, but not everything in it is perfect. These little touches go a long way. So once I had all that done, then I had 5 different KT66s that the owner provided, and he said they were all good. And I was able to match, one pair quite well and make one other semi-matched pair. The semi-matched pair in this amp, I don't remember which one it is now, is one of these, is set to about 64% on one tube and 55% on the others, a 9.5% difference in current draw between those tubes, but the common mode cancellation is not a problem. So we're going to call that amp roughly 60% idle dissipation. That's the average. The other amp, both tubes are much better matched, and it actually is at 60%. One's at like 61, and the other's at 60 or 59.5. So both amps are biased, quote, the same. Getting there was kind of tough because not because of the KT66s, one of which, by the way, will not pair with any of these, but because the amps came in with very different rectifier tubes. One of the amps came in with a Sylvania, an old Sylvania, and the other one came in with the current production Electro-Harmonix. And I took some measurements, and the Electro-Harmonix drops 10 more volts than the Sylvania. And not knowing whether maybe the Sylvania was the issue or the Electro-Harmonix was the issue, I got a JAN Philips new old stock 5U4GB, and it has exactly the same voltage drop, within half a volt of the Sylvania. So that Electro-Harmonix is just dropping a lot more voltage than the others. So now both amps have roughly the same B+ at roughly the same bias. The B+ cannot be exact because the tubes are not a matched quad. So the variations here are the different KT66s. And I'll give him back that Electro-Harmonix, which he can use, but it's not going to be performing the same way. I could not get these amps to be, quote, matched with that Electro-Harmonix because the B+ and bias are very different. So if I were to bias the output section the same, the preamp voltages would be all over the map, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on the subject of matching output tubes and common mode cancellation, which I referred to when I'm talking about the phase inverter grids here, there's a lot of mythology on the net about whether output tubes need to be precisely matched or whether some people say it doesn't matter, and other people say, there can be a benefit to them being slightly mismatched. And yeah, there can be sometimes some slight tonal interest differences. Better, worse is not really valid unless you're talking about it catching on fire or whatever. But whether something is different is a different thing than better. Some people are going to prefer the sound of slight asymmetrical distortion that mismatch or slight mismatch gives. Other people are going to want the more, I guess you might say, pure sound of a matched pair. What you want to do is make sure that in any pair of tubes or quad of tubes, that they are matched well enough that one of them doesn't hog all the current and damage itself, and that they're matched well enough that there's not that lack of common mode cancellation. And here to demonstrate that, I'm showing one of these amps being powered up. And at the moment it's powered up and the voltage begins to flow out of the rectifier tube to the output tubes, those output tubes are warming up and they're drawing current, but they're warming up at different rates. So one tube will be drawing more current than the other until the point where both tubes come up to their stable operating condition, at which point they're hopefully going to be drawing pretty much the same amount of current. That's what we call matching. But during the time before they come up to their stable operating point, they're not going to reject hum. That hum is coming from ripple on the B+ supply. The heater supply has a noise field. All these things are usually rejected by matched output tubes, but while they're warming up, you can hear that hum. So at this point, the owner has one excess KT66, which can't really be matched to and used in these amps without noise. I tried. It's noisy with any of the four here. He's got a pair of 6L6s, which are fine. They'll be returned with the amp as well. He has a spare 5U4GB, which will work in any of these amps. You just have to rebias it a little bit. But it's better to have the JAN Philips and the Sylvania, I think. I think it's nice when a rectifier tube has the voltage drop indicated on the data sheet. Electro-Harmonix, pay attention. They're not the only culprit. Look at the wide world of 5Y3s out there. But these amps are really sounding good. In the next video, we'll get to play them, and you can hear whether you agree with me that this is a good choice for a master volume and get a sense of what the amps really sound like. But now they are sounding very close to being identical. There's no such thing as two purely identical amps, just due to the tolerances of things and all that. But the secondaries coming out of the output transformer, the power transformers, are the same. Their bias is the same. The B+, the DC supply to the preamp and everything is within 5 to 10 volts of each other. And the issues with the tube retainers and longevity and reliability have all been addressed. So I think we're in a really good place.